I just want to say that I'm really grateful that Achebe would engage in a conversation with us right now about this really important time, this 1619 moment, this 400 years of resistance time. She is uniquely qualified, having lived a life of civil rights activism, and presently employed as a trainer around all things race and culture. So I was emotional there at Achebe, I'll say. and I would love to just say that you inspired me. We were talking about what we might do today, and a sermon is a living thing. It doesn't finish till it finishes. But listening to Achebe last weekend think about what we might say, I got really clear that I couldn't preach a sermon that was just about, this has been terrible, but that I wanted us to be able to think about how we've resisted, what resistance looks like. And the text that I had picked lent itself to that three-point thing. It's lent itself to the itching ears talk that is white supremacy masquerading as Christianity, and to the two stories of Fannie Lou Hamer as a resistor, and then our own resistance here. So I think with that, I just want you to take us where you want to go.
Well, together, we're going there together here. Jacqui, that first, I was so glad that you chose Timothy. Jacqui was thinking about the Exodus.
The Exodus.
Yeah. The Exodus, which of course would have been, you would have done a fabulous job with it in terms of the liberation that implies, and how much African Americans definitely almost clung to that mythology, that myth, and the reality of Exodus. But I'm so glad you chose to wrestle with Timothy. Because the itchy ears piece, in terms of my focus on 400 years of resistance, the itchy ears piece speaks to me, first of all, about how itchy ears wouldn't want to hear that there is resistance, that there was resistance from the jump. From the jump. I'm talking about, I'm a trainer and used to doing kind of dramatics, et cetera, so you're going to bear with me as I ask you to think about 1619. Ask us to stop, take a moment, and listen to history. So I want you to really listen to this and hear the waves of the Atlantic Ocean beating against this ship, the Sao Paulo Bautista, that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. Feel the energy, the feelings, the skin even, of those 20-odd slaves in the hull of that ship. Focus even on one or two of them. So the New York Times 1619 project is just brilliant. And if you haven't, you can't get hard copies of it anymore, but it's all online. So this is one of the pieces from that project. And this statement: sometime in 1619, a Portuguese slave ship, the Sao Paulo Bautista, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean with a hull, thank you very much. Yeah. All right. With a hull filled with human cargo. Feel it. We just read that statement here, human cargo. There were human beings. Captive Africans from Angola and southwestern Africa. Nicole Hannah Jones, who kind of shepherded the whole 1619 project with the New York Times, she sort of tries to help create this image too by thinking about, again, think about one or two of those people down there. You think of the whole group. What must have been going through their heads over those weeks and months of travel, having been herded to the coast of West Africa and onto a ship knowing not where they were going. What must have been going through their heads, their minds? And she sort of frames it a little bit as maybe it could have been something like, we certainly could imagine fear and denial at first in terms of the stages of thinking. Surely not. What? in a minute this is going to be over. I'm going to be back in my village, or what? But then the fear and denial after a while doesn't work. So, well, after it's like, what is it's not getting you anywhere, because a week has passed, and now we're into a second week, and this vessel is just continuing to move in some direction we know not where. So despair might set in. And you despair for another few days or a week and so forth, but despair is not getting you out of this either. And she imagines, and I think we all could, that maybe then the next step would simply be the resignation. But resignation, we're going to talk about resignation that's not just that's the end. In a sense, the resignation was the beginning, because, of course, you get to the end of this journey, step off that ship in Jamestown, near Jamestown, Virginia, and there's a rebirth, in a sense, into slavery. You're reborn as a slave. But I maintain that there's also, you're reborn into resistance. Have to be. You have to know, you would just have to know that while our bodies could not do it, could not say it, absolutely not. You're beaten and whipped and shackled. Your body's not going to be able to say much in terms of resistance, but your soul is crying out, no. No, 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 in the name of your Jesus, no. I am not a slave. I am a human being. You have to know that nobody's going to think, well, that's it, in terms of the internal workings of their soul. Itchy talk doesn't want to hear.
Yeah. That doesn't fit the story.
It doesn't fit the story.
It
doesn't fit like
of
you.
Those helpless Jacquies.
Yeah. And when you talk about the fact that the resistance is, in so many ways, I have like numerous historical examples of the resistance, but just go to living our life, staying alive. And of course, there are no records much of the numbers of suicide. People did take their lives and jump in rivers, and of course, even before jumping off that ship, we know that 4,000 to 6,000 were lost, in the Middle Passage itself, and some of that, people taking their lives. But the resistance that was there actually is something that both the resistance and the horror, I mean the absolute staggering horror of it all. 1619 is calling us to listen to that, pay attention to all of it, but also listen to and know something about the resistance that was there. The weight of all this history, means that we can no longer ignore. It cannot no longer be ignored in all of its staggering brutality and horror and all of its resistance. James Baldwin said, and I was thinking about the itchy ears, but more than that, in Paul saying, you have to keep pushing and resisting and so forth, and make them, in a sense, make them see, make them know that truth is here. And so the resisting, as well as the actual horror having to be faced, I thought so much of James Baldwin during the course of when we were actually talking and planning. And especially because in our racial justice task force, we read his Fire Next Time. And in the Fire Next Time, this letter to his nephew, James Baldwin, says very clearly that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed. Nothing will be changed until it's faced. So, all the stories, all the narratives, all the myths, all the data, even the actions, not even, especially the actions and the policies and everything, all of those that sustain the legacy of enslavement have to change. Right. All those narratives. And even as we sit here in middle thinking, oh, well, we are just so evolved that we don't run those narratives anymore. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And I'm talking all of us in our heads. Those of us descendants of the enslaved, those of us descendants of the enslavers. We're still running those stories and those narratives. I said, but they have to change. White people, you have to step up and face that which must be changed for your own soul survival, for one thing. Because the privilege, the white privilege that you possessed has been forged through these 400 years, almost to perfection in terms of what the system intends to happen. And not by, happenstance or whatever, by design. We say things like, race is a construct. Yeah, it is a construct, which means somebody made it. Somebody created it. Step by step by step. And if we just stop and look at, 1730, colony of Virginia. We're not even a country yet. The colony of Virginia. First definition of white, because we got to get this stuff laid out. Nice and clear, huh?
Oh, yeah. Very clear.
Yeah, very clear. House of Burgesses, it was called. That was the parliament for Virginia. House of Burgesses. They proposed in order to, and now they're thinking in terms of the colonies really establishing themselves. They're thinking about, who's going to have the power, who will own the land, who will, be able to vote and govern, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we lay it all out. White people. But now who's white? White, first definition, to have not one drop of Negro blood, not one drop of Indian blood is to be white. And then you can, but the owning property is there, so even poor white people aren't necessarily in the mix here. That wasn't the only definition. They went back and back and back and back. And you want to hear this one that they ended up with. White, not one drop of Negro blood, not one drop of Indian blood. With a special exemption for the descendants of John Rolfe. John Rolfe, mentioned right here, he was there. He was there when this cargo came in. He became one of the richest, most powerful landowners tobacco landowners in the state of Virginia. And his descendants, of course, inherited. Now, this is 1619. We're talking 1730, the definition. But his descendants have gone on to become the richest, most powerful people. So they get exempted. I mean, you don't know that it's actually his descendants that get exempted, but that special exemption embraces the descendants of John Rolfe, who are descendants of John Rolfe was married to, the mother of his children was Pocahontas. So you got at least one drop of Indian blood in these folks, but we construct it and we get to control the narrative. Yeah, the narrative.
His whiteness and his power got to decide that he could decide to make an exception about whiteness.
Yeah. And so this privilege, you have to understand in terms of when we say to you, our white brothers and sisters, you have got to step up and step in, and you've got to recognize, knowing that the privilege that you possess in this moment really exists, that you possess simply by existing is bound up with someone else's oppression, with our oppression, with the oppression of me and my people. So to understand and then decide, okay, you want to change the narrative? And that's what we assume everybody who steps through that door in Middle and so many others. You want to change the narrative? Change the story. Change the story. Change the story through your actions. And so, and for black people, we have to change the story, again, for salvation of our souls also.
Yep.
For the sustaining, of our souls. And we have to change the narrative for the sustaining and the salvation of our bodies, our black bodies that have been so denigrated and so negated. Our bodies that need to be free, not freed, we were freed, that need to be free, to be a total, fully, recognized human being filled with our dignity, filled with all the promise of who we are. So we have, as I said, kind of a litany that we could go into, Jacqui, about what the resistance already looked like, because I see again that resistance beginning from the jump in my soul, and then all the ways that the plantation owner, I want to change that word plantation, forced labor camps.
Yeah, that's better. That's honest.
The owners and managers of those forced labor camps, again, itchy ears, itchy eyes, could only see people dancing and clapping.
They must be okay.
Oh, they must be okay. No, we are resisting you determining that we are not human. That we are not indeed worthy of, and we can fast forward to Dred Scott decision, say that you are not worthy of any white man observing, respecting any human right that you might think you have. And
I think it would be really great to do the litany, because part of what's happened yesterday, Achebe, I was in Austin, Texas, taking Middle Project on the road to talk about racism with a well-meaning group of mostly white folks, 2 people of color in the room, well-meaning, but stuck in a story, a certain kind of story.
Yeah.
Without the litany, without the rehearsing, without the changing of the narrative. One of the white men in the room told a story. He said, I don't want to take a lot of time. Let me just tell you a story. There's a man who comes to my race class, and he will be telling a story of something that happened in 1960, and he'll say the N-word while he tells the story. He says, and I've told him I don't think that that's appropriate, and he's told me you're thwarting my creativity when you say the N-word. So he's white, and the guy's white, and there's a few men of color in the room. And he wonders why the men don't come back. And I go, do you believe in any world that we'd be in a room of gay people saying, I'm going to say the F word, I can't even say the word, I'm going to and that's going to, so his whiteness couldn't let him see the denigration that happens to the people of color in the room, the black people in the room where the N-word is used. And he still felt that he needed to protect the white man's right to be white. So Achebe, when we don't talk about the stories enough. Okay, so go.
So just a little bit of the litany. So we're in the 17th century, and we're moving, along a horrific trajectory called slavery in U.S. North America. And in that context, folks are beginning to resist in very, very, open and obvious ways that history, we get just little snippets of it. In terms of the insurrections that slaves engaged in, we think Nat Turner, and that's like kind of end of story. And that get glorified in Hollywood movies, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's almost kind of like a throwaway. There were insurrections upon insurrections upon insurrections, and plantation, forced labor camps, forced labor camps. And sometimes it was 2 or 3, sometimes it was 6, 12, and of course they were put down violently, always violently, whether it's cutting off your legs or so that you don't run, or beating you to death, or whatever. The insurrections were numerous. The self-freeing movements and actions, which we know as, slaves running away. They're called runaway slaves. We'd like to say self-freeing human beings.
I love that.
Self-freeing human beings. And they were numerous. We know, again, we can call to mind, immediately, and the movie is out now, Harriet Tubman. And God bless her. I mean, she was fierce. But she was more than just the bullet points, in a sense, that the culture even has given us about, carrying the gun and I'll shoot you if you don't turn back. And, she went back and she went back. And the Moses of her people, she was even more than that. And she was more than that, and at the same time, she's emblematic of how many others had run away. Because when the fugitive, she leaves in 1849. The plantation in Maryland. And it's 1850 that we get the Fugitive Slave Act. I brought quite a few around. So the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't because Harriet Tubman came back and got her, about 70 people that she freed, including a lot of her family. All of her family until towards the end she had to go back and get her aging parents. But she had 7 brothers and sisters and went back and got them all. But it wasn't just because of Harriet Tubman that the Fugitive Slave Act, there had to be numerous, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slaves for them to now move to, we got to create a whole policy and legislation here to stop this self-freeing, movement and impetus. And so you get, I'm going to talk about the resilience and the resistance of black people. White folks, you have a legacy of resistance also that you need to really click into. And so we have, this is just a little piece that I have, in my house that I picked up, I don't know, back in the 70s or so when I first started, doing this work. But here's the abolitionists at work in Massachusetts, where, this is on this thing now, but just imagine this is just a poster that's all over Boston that says, colored people, caution. Colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and the police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and the alderman, which comes from the acceptance by the entire North, as well as South, of the Fugitive Slave Act, because of their order, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the tracks of the most unfortunate of your race. So shun them as so many hounds on the tracks of your most unfortunate race. And they go on, keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. I love that, top eye open.
Can I put that
watching that. Somebody had to do that. These were organized. It wasn't the fugitives themselves, because they're staying as low as possible in a low form. It is abolitionists, white allies, and so forth, who are, stepping in. So the resistance in terms of that litany is both mostly the black folk, but certainly increasing numbers of white folks in the middle and late 18th century. You had also black abolitionists. We hear of abolition and we think of white folks helping. Not only. We had black abolitionists who were a huge part of the Underground Railroad in particular. And the Underground Railroad, again, we kind of almost like a throwaway. Yeah, some nice people who let folks go to their house. And again, we don't tend to think of black folks as being a huge part of that. They're a huge part. In Philadelphia, and not just Philadelphia, but I'm thinking, going up through the Mason-Dixon line states in terms of Virginia and Maryland, Delaware, and on up into North. So the black abolitionists, free and non-free blacks, white allies, and other activists were integral to the success of the Underground Railroad, self-freeing Negroes. This legacy of pride and resilience then takes us into, let's just go to the Civil War. Our time. The Civil War, the Civil War itself, in terms of think of the soldiers, with all the shenanigans that it took to actually, for Lincoln and others to say, okay, you can fight. There was a whole resistance to letting freed slaves, self-freeing slaves and so forth fight, but it came to a point where they needed them. Yeah. But the black slaves themselves recognized this is a point of resistance. We joined them just like it, of course, had already happened in the Revolutionary War. The hope that in joining this battle, somehow I will get my freedom. And so that resistance, and of course that was, right through World War I, World War II, Korean War, and so forth, always that hope. But let's come to the end of the Civil War. And in terms of reparations, we tend to think, this is a new idea. Reparations, again, right off. Folks were trying to legislate around reparations, but there was also this very organic kind of move to repair and self-repair. And self-repair in terms of one's own body, but just have the image of the war has devastated the landscape. White folks have left most of the forced labor camps. Black folks are moving back and forth and in a state of kind of confusion and puzzlement. Where should we go? What shall we do? But history records that there were a number of people who began to carve out pieces of land. Of course, the farms are left, so the farming implements and the equipment and so forth are there. People take it and move to cultivate land. And then you get, at the same simultaneously, then the 40 acres and a mule legislation being put forth. It's not just a kind of concept in the culture about that. It was a very focused, clear notion of reparations. And I add then resistance. The 40 acres and a mule didn't come to full fruition, but there are instances of, for example, Catherine Franke, in her book, which I highly recommend. Catherine Franke, Columbia Law, has written, her latest book is called Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. And she, in this book, makes an amazing, Catherine Franke is a white ally in 2020. Is this 2020?
Yeah.
Whatever, where are we? 2019.
Close enough,
2019. Of course, 2019. And this book makes a compelling case for reparations, for all that, and she does it by amplifying the history of my enslaved brothers and sisters and ancestors. So, and she talks about the Georgia Sea Island experiment in the 40 acres and a mule. Didn't get exactly 40 acres, but the actual of carving out plots of land for individual black families, freed slaves. And the policy that was made in Georgia was stated very clearly. This is your land. We leave you to it to repair yourselves, and you need to be left on. And their whole thing was like, no white person will be allowed to come into this area and disrupt and so forth. This is your land to repair. That was really, unfortunately, just a year before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
And then the new president totally reverses
So
all of that
totally
legislation
reverses all
and
of that.
kind of unleashes the
Yeah,
white councils and the
the
lynching.
biggest are let off their leash.
Yep.
But before we get to that, a little more litany in terms of the resistance in this moment. We do have, as a part of our history, and you want to delve into this history to get a sense of the resilience and the resistance, the history of the radical Reconstruction. And we need to be calling it that, not just the Reconstruction era. It was the radical Reconstruction, because you're going from totally, enslaving a group of human beings to, of course, the South didn't know what to do, and you had to have the soldiers from the North there, tempering the instincts of hate and revenge and lashing out and so forth. And so they were there. But for only 11 years, the radical Reconstruction. 250 years enslaved, 11 years to have a shot at really being free, not freedom. But listen to what they did in those 11 years. First of all, the farmers, and I talked about people beginning to just organically carve out farming. And this is what they did. These were the people who knew farming. They farmed, they tilled the soil, they planted the seeds, they did, and so forth. They had the expertise, and they did it. So despite the backlash that came, is another word, that came in all manners, even with the Union troops being there to keep a lid on things, despite all the horrors that did happen during this time, even of radical Reconstruction, black folks managed to acquire quite a bit of land. Yeah. By 1920, take this example, by 1920, former slaves and descendants of former slaves owned about 1 million farms. Just think of it, 1 million farms. Now, small farms, small plots, some, a bit larger, and so forth. But that's, an awful lot of land. That was 14% of all American farms at the time. For all kinds of reasons, including contemporary realities and so forth, but certainly more the historical realities of repression and oppression. That number is now below 2%. Politicians, the representatives really of the people, as the formerly enslaved folk vigorously, almost like zealously engaged in the political process. Immediately, upon relief, what we saw was droves of black folks going to the polls because they could vote. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, I'll get to that, was real. That was so real for people in terms of ending slavery, giving the right to vote and protection, as citizens. So the whole business of representation in order to secure your place as a full human being, in the fullness of your dignity and participating in all of society, the elected officials was, just critically important in that moment. So in droves, black folk in South Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, etc., elect and send to the state legislatures about 600 formerly enslaved folk, all men, but formerly enslaved folks, 600 in the state legislatures and, hundreds in other local positions, and sent 16 folk to Congress.
How many of you know that? How many of us know that?
Yeah,
Good. I love
have
that.
that,
Okay,
yeah.
thank God for the,
Yeah,
that's
hundreds.
great.
And 16 folks. And they didn't just sit around. I actually, again, in terms of, well, I might have everything, but there's just this image. Some of you, again, have seen the magazine or have seen this image in any number of places. And you can't really see it when I hold it up here, but the image of these
Put the camera on that,
7,
Jeff.
8 legislators. This is 7 years later. When you said in part of the thing, I'm not sure that they are ready for whatever it was. This is like 7 years out of slavery. And you've got 600 people in the state legislatures and 16 in Congress and hundreds of folk, doing, and then this is just the official kind of thing. And then human beings known as, descendants of Africa, African Americans we become, are going about their lives,
Teaching,
trying to go, teaching and
nursing in the community.
Nursing, journalism, the whole bit. And I like to tell at this point of radical Reconstruction the story of my great-grandfather, who was a part of this whole resistance and movement into the fullness of our humanity. My great-grandfather, I'll tell you how I got the whole story, is after Roots was shown, and we were all, those of you who are old enough to even engaged in that cultural experience. It was a cultural experience for us, for everybody in America. After Roots, I go home and as many black folk did in different kinds of ways. You want to know more now, because that's just in terms of contemporary, the beginning, the pricking of our consciousness about slavery in a way that we want to get kind of positively into it, because again, I could go on and on how we didn't really, the humiliation and the embarrassment and the shame of slavery was such that we did not want to know about slavery for a very, very long time. But I go home and I put the mic under my mother's mouth and I say, just talk. And I want to give you a certain few phrases that I heard when I was growing up, and you kind of like fill it in for me, because they were just like, fragments of ideas. And one of them was that we often heard the expression in our family gatherings, speaking about my great-grandfather. Papa came out of slavery in 1865 and made a beeline for the Freedmen's Bureau to learn figuring. That was exactly the phrase. It got repeated over and over and over again. And my family, so I'm saying to my mom, what does that mean? And this is now her grandfather, and she's saying, oh, well, Papa was made a preacher in slavery, given the slave Bible, which, was a whole re-edited piece, or stuff left out and stuff put in or whatever, was made a preacher, so he knew how to read, which we know was forbidden for most black folks, except where it was necessary to sustain the system. Teaching my great-grandfather to read was necessary to sustain the system, as far as because they didn't want people out the edge of the woods as they saw them, on the Sunday afternoon when they, jumping and dancing and doing stuff that was, that's kind of Afrocentric. There, we got to pull them in and give them, Christianize this stuff. And so, my grandfather was enrolled in that, but that's not what he wanted to do. So 1865, when he makes a beeline for the Freedmen's Bureau to learn figuring, he wants to learn math so that he can open a general store. I got the reading under, thank you very much. I need the math, and he did. This is in Live Oak, Florida. This is North Florida, where my ancestors were enslaved. And he opens a general store, and sure enough, it becomes successful. And now he becomes one of those hundreds of local officials appointed and kind of like, moving into positions. Because it's so successful, he moves the store to the crossroads where the stagecoach comes through in, and they come through with the mill and they around the flour and drop, huge bags of flour at his store. They drop the mail at his place. So he becomes Postmaster General for North Florida, whatever little district it is. It simply meant that he got the mail, he sorted it, and he took it around to folks. And because he had 10 children, the kids could run the store and farm, because everybody still farmed a little bit. But come 1877, again, 12 years, 1877, and we don't know the exact date that Papa's farm store was burned down, but we know that it's the Compromise of 1877 that has done it. The Northern troops, Union troops must leave. The Jim Crow laws are already set in place. And so they're just waiting at the ready to begin the terrorizing, and resetting things in order, in the order of slavery by another name. Called Jim Crow. And so Papa's store is burned to the ground. All of his crops are burned, because that was, farming. That was part of the survival. And I am here, I sit here today, because at that moment, at that time, whoever perpetrated these actions in Live Oak, Florida, at that time told my great-grandfather that he wasn't going to be lynched. They wouldn't lynch him, because he needed to go back to being a preacher and keep his people in line. In terms of that narrative of what black faith and religion and so forth was all about. And again, little did they know, the religion was so much a part of the resistance. I'm being brought up in St. Paul AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and every Sunday there we are sitting in the pews and people are singing and shouting and so forth. And most of them, 90%, of the congregation are are maids, former slave maids and janitors and stewards and on Pullman on the railroads, et cetera. But they come to church on Sunday and they are the proud leaders of a community and of a congregation. And they give the sense of the hope and the fight and the continuing and the passing on. So the resistance was, real. The legacy of resilience was continued and growing and passing and passed on to folk. But 1877, we get what was called the failure of Reconstruction. And during that time, I just want to mention also in terms of the litany, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were part of what they called the Reconstruction Amendments. And and preceding that, even in 1866, was the first Civil Rights Act. Right. And that first Civil Rights Act was one of the most expansive, articulation of human rights and possibilities that this nation had seen, for sure. But the 13th Amendment eliminating slavery, the 14th Amendment giving citizenship and respecting protection of the law, and the 15th Amendment giving the voter rights were huge. But again, the failure is that, we had to, 100 years later, in terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we had to a do-over, to redo the stuff, and we're still doing it, are we not? Continue at litany. Let's jump 1890s, say between 1890s, 1920, the sort of radical new thought, Negro thought, the radical New Negro movement, it was called, the New Negro. And it's huge. The way that I'm saying it, that was a huge moment. W.E.B. Du Bois steps on to the world stage, in that moment, and he is an integral part of the NAACP. But he's part of a group, whether it's him and Monroe Trotter and James Weldon Johnson. Think of our, the Negro National Anthem. But he was an amazing, and again, activist and engaged. And this movement was so committed to trying to overcome the failure of the Reconstruction and the Jim Crow pieces that had set in, that they were just so clear. We had the urgency of the work and the task, that we have to do this work in order to, again, sort of get back to the moment of the radical Reconstruction. And W.B. Du Bois is saying, if we don't do this work now, our ancestors will be turning over in their grave. In terms of the work not finished, just because the Reconstruction didn't work and so forth, we still, have the work to do. And so if we don't do this work, not only will our ancestors be turning over in our grave, but they also were saying, and our children will never forgive us. Mm-hmm. That's right. Again, you've got to feel the power and the energy and the strength behind the resistance and the resilience that is in that statement, and all the actions that came after it. The actions that had to do with, the publications and so forth that were a huge part of that, trying the intervention in the summer of 1919 with the race riots, et cetera. I think it will end the litany with one of W.E.B. Du Bois's, I wouldn't say final acts, but it was the disappointment around this ultimately was very difficult for him to sustain. And some of you might know what I'm talking about. Ultimately, W.E. Du Bois left this country after he'd done so much of the resistance and the resilience work. But it was just, too much to sustain. But one of his acts then was, along with him, others leaders of the NAACP at that time, we're talking now the post-World War II, just after, when the UN Commission on Human Rights is creating the Declaration of Human Rights. And they get very clear that this is a moment, talk about for the fight, to up the ante, to up the ante on the fight. We've got a tool here, an instrument of civil society, and so forth, that just might be, the answer, our way out, to get the attention for the kind of oppression that we as Negroes in that context were experiencing in America. So they created an appeal to this organization and to the United Nations. They felt that a change in the terminology from civil rights to human rights could make all the difference in the world. And just listen for a moment. So this was the strategy that they employed, and they called this comprehensive document that they created for the United Nations an appeal to the world, a statement of denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal to the United Nations for redress. The fate of that particular effort is just too painful for words, and we don't have time to enumerate it here, but just hear what they're trying to say to the world. There were about maybe 12 million African Americans, and they told the world that we're less a tenth of the people who form this largely segregated caste with restricted legal rights and many illegal disabilities placed upon us. We are descendants of the Africans brought to America during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and reduced to slave labor. This group has not complete biological unity, but varies in color from white to black and comprises a great variety of physical characteristics. Since many are the offspring of white European Americans as well as Africans and American Indians. There are a large number of white Americans who also descend from Negroes, but who are not counted in the colored group, nor subject to caste restrictions because the preponderance of white blood conceals their descent. And then just a little piece of this document goes on, and it just lays it all out. But it's here, the so-called American Negro group has a strong hereditary cultural unity, born of slavery, of common suffering, prolonged proscription and curtailment of our political and civil rights, and especially because of economic and social disabilities. But largely from this fact has arisen our cultural gifts to America. Our rhythm, our music, our folk songs, our religious faith, our customs, etc., have contributed to American art and literature and the defense of our country in every war on land, sea, and in the air, and especially the hard, continuous toil upon which the prosperity and wealth of this continent has largely been built. Kind of case closed. He goes on, case closed. And so we have been resisting from our souls and in the courts and in the streets from the jump. That is a part of the 1619 story that we asked you to please receive and take into your life and your consciousness and help keep changing the story.
Amen, Achebe.
Amen.
Good.